Welcome to the CNPS San Gabriel Mountains chapter monthly program meeting. I'm Cliff McLean, chapter president, and beside me is Gabi McLean, a former chapter president. So now I'd like to bring on Scott Kleinrock, who is our speaker for tonight, and he volunteered to introduce himself. And so I will let him do that because he knows a lot more about him than I do. So go ahead, Scott.
Thank you very much, Cliff. So this is going to be a roughly 45-minute talk about California native garden design. If you want to learn more, or if you know people who are maybe brand new to native plants as well and don't have any experience, there is an extended version of this presentation available online at cbwcd.org/YouTube. It's a class that I teach as part of my work at the Waterwise Community Center. I'll tell you a little bit more about who we are in just a moment. And so for this 45 minutes, what I've done is I've kind of jumped past making the case for native plants, because most people here at the Native Plant Society don't need to hear that. So this longer version starts there, and this is kind of an excerpt of highlights of that longer talk. And so first I'll tell you a little bit about who we are at the Waterwise Community Center. We are a special district. Formerly we're known as the Chino Basin Water Conservation District, a special district similar to like a school district or a fire district. We're a special district that serves a service area at the western edge of San Bernardino County. And we were created in 1949 specifically for water conservation. We don't provide water to any customers. We are a water conservation public agency. And the district was created in 1949 when most of the area was agriculture. And really water conservation meant something very different. It essentially meant let's hold on to it and keep it for our farms and not let anyone else get it, to really oversimplify it. But as the whole area has urbanized, the mission has really had to change. And so today we say that our mission is really threefold: to demonstrate, to educate, and to percolate. With demonstration, normally, although it's closed to the public now, we have a little over 4 acres of demonstration gardens showing lots of solutions with Waterwise plants, including lots of native plants. Our education programs range from things like what I'm engaged with tonight to a whole suite of workshops throughout the year for homeowners, professional development, and K-12 STEM integrated programming. We have shifted all of our adult education to webinars and are teaching 3 webinars a month. And you can check out our offerings, lots of things that this group might be interested in, at our website, cbwcd.org. And to percolate, we also actually own and operate a number of large-scale infiltration basins, literally mostly old gravel pits from gravel quarries that helped provide things for like the concrete that built Los Angeles. And today they are integrated, tied into storm drains, and actively managed for cleaning and percolating groundwater. And so in all of that, these are just some pictures of some of the groups that we work with at all scales. And so through all of that, I came on as their conservation programs manager, really engaged in how water conservation is related to what we do in the urban and suburban landscape. And through that, I get to talk to a lot of people about the benefits of native gardens, which brings me here this evening. If you're interested in any of the work that we do, I'd encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. You just get 1 email a month, not a lot of junk, and you can sign up at cbwcd.org/newsletter. So who am I and why am I even talking to you about all of this? Well, my name is Scott Kleinrock. I am currently Conservation Programs Manager at the Waterwise Community Center. Before that, I was the Landscape Design and Planning Coordinator at the Huntington Botanical Gardens, part of the Library, Art Collections, and Botanical Gardens. And really, I got interested in the urban landscape through growing up in suburban San Fernando Valley. Always thought it was curious and not particularly inspiring the way people decided to build their cities and live in them. And as I was finishing college and starting to want to find some sort of direction, I just got really interested in maybe being able to engage in ideas about how to change how we do that, and maybe do that in more interesting ways. And eventually that led me to the world of native plants and to picking up a master's degree in landscape architecture from Cal Poly Pomona. And today I'm currently often either visiting gardens or out in the wild in my free time, and always thinking about how that relates to what we can do in our built urban and suburban landscapes to improve how they are as places to live in and improve the world while we are at it. And so that's basically me in a nutshell, and what brings me here to talk to you about this tonight. And I want to be very clear. I've been working with native plants for quite a few years, but I definitely don't see myself as a leading expert in native plants, nor in landscape design, but I've been kind of interacting with the two of them and experimenting for quite a few years, and learning from my mistakes enough to really develop some ideas about them. So tonight we will see a combination of images, but a lot of images of projects that I've worked on, not because I necessarily think that those are the best or most successful landscapes that have native plants in design, but because I know exactly what I was thinking as I was putting together those designs, and can really interpret for you my ideas of the design process and how it interacts with native plants. And then I also want to make sure that credit is given where credit is due in this presentation. A lot of the pictures, as well as a lot of the gardens that the pictures are of, are not just my work, but also a combination, especially our home gardens, of my work and my partner, Kyra's work, who more of you probably know than you know me. And so I would not have the garden that I have at home, nor most of the pictures of them, if it was not for her. And so for today's workshop, you'll see a couple of cross outs, because those are some of the topics that I'm skipping over for this particular truncated version of it. But we're going to talk a little bit about where we would even start with design and native plants, a little bit about taking inspiration from natural plant communities, bringing up elements of native garden design, some of which are similar to any sort of garden design, a little bit about choosing plants, and then we'll bring it together in a detailed example of the design process and execution in creating a native garden. And then we'll wrap up and talk about some additional resources. And so with that, I am going to start at the very beginning with how I normally engage the public with beginning to talk about native plants. So for some of you who are real native plant experts who are in attendance tonight, if you don't get new insights about design or the design process, I'm hoping that you'll get some insights about talking to the general public about working with native plants. And so I'd like to start with the premise that landscapes take up a lot of space in especially suburban Southern California, probably where most people involved in the San Gabriel Mountains chapter live. If we look at our suburban landscapes in an aerial photograph on something like Google Maps on aerial photo view, there's actually quite a bit of green. Down here, there's definitely a lot and maybe too much concrete and asphalt, but it's very different than looking at downtown LA or New York City from an aerial photo. And for a long time in our suburban landscapes, the question has really been, does it fit in? Does it fit in with what the neighbors have in their front yards, especially? And if you wanted to get beyond that, the next question might just be, what does it look like? And I want my gardens to look beautiful. I want the gardens of people who I work with to be beautiful. But I really feel that the last series of droughts opened up a widespread opportunity for a new dominant question, which is, what do our landscapes do for us? And what do they do for the world? And with this guiding question, the answer is that California native landscapes just do more than the landscapes that they would be replacing. If you don't have a kid who's learning how to play soccer or learning to walk, a lawn just doesn't do that much for most of us other than requiring maintenance. And California native landscapes do so much more. So this is where, for the general public, I list all the great things that California native landscapes do. But for this, I'll just say amongst those, it also gives your cat something interesting to look at. And we will move on because I'm not going to try to sell you on the habitat and the beauty. We'll talk a little bit about it, but this audience mostly knows about that. So here's some big grounding ideas for our presentation. A garden is a living ecosystem. Setting up a garden is very different than interior design, buying a new couch. It's always going to grow and it's always going to change. A garden's a process more than a thing. It's never finished. It's always in motion. But thinking this way is really liberating. It makes things more fun and much more interesting. It's less about trying to keep something that's picture perfect, that captures that abundant beauty of spring all year round. And it's more about living in this evolving ecosystem, this thing that's going through the cycles of the year. So even when, for example, the wildflower meadow is pretty dried out for the year, then you're not only enjoying the more subtle differences in the color, but you're also enjoying all of the birds and life that the dried seeds bring to the garden. Not just based in aesthetics. It becomes based in a larger world of natural science, and it gives us a way to root our designs and our actions in our garden. And this actually makes gardening success much easier by designing from the beginning something that's really this living, breathing system rather than simply something beautiful to look at that maybe provides a little bit of food for the birds. But where do we start? So one big idea is that we don't start here. Eventually, we go to Rancho Santa Ana or Theodore Payne Foundation and buy lots of plants there. But we don't start there, because when we start there, what happens is we buy one of this and two of that, and something has a really interesting flower in a 1-gallon pot, but then you bring it home and realize that it needs partial shade, but you only have full sun, and some things end up with higher water needs and some things with lower water needs, but you're still going to try to cram them all in the ground anyways, and it's not really a recipe for success. Where we start is with inspiration and then with design. So briefly, because I know this group knows about what the San Gabriel Mountains look like, we're going to start with some inspiration in the San Gabriel Mountains with a specific purpose. We're going to go on a quick little walk, and we're going to use this as a sort of test. This is a quick walk that I did kind of upper Arroyo, Pasadena, up above the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in August of 2015, so in the midst of our historic drought. Interesting at how to use native plants for design. I wanted to see what looks good out there, what's keeping itself alive with obviously no human work, and what things are looking like. Important patterns to note in terms of what we should be thinking about for design: plant density and what's on the ground. So in terms of how things are looking, so here we have California coffeeberry. This was in reflected heat on an asphalt road, looking just fine. Hadn't gotten really much water for years. Young California fuchsias, young oak trees, growing just fine. Native buckwheat going into flower. And looking on the ground, what we don't see is wall-to-wall, deep, thick layers of wood chip mulch with plants only spaced far in between. We see combinations of natural leaf litter. We see exposed soil that's pretty much like decomposed granite. Here we have mountain mahogany, datura, and a very natural mulch layer created mostly from the best mulch there is, the natural leaf turnover of the plants themselves. Grape really taking advantage of some wetter areas, and plenty of shrubs that do just fine in bare exposed rock with reflected heat. Some asters in that nice organic layer, edge of some oak trees, toyon, Bruce. Looking again at the amount of stone that there is. And then you get to cool areas, oak woodland areas with an invasive understory, but the areas where all of a sudden you can take a breath, even on a hot day in August, and it's just nice to linger. New growth on Big Berry Manzanita, looking absolutely gorgeous in the middle of a drought. And certainly, plant communities as a whole did suffer. There were individual losses, but overall, these plants were so well adapted And that's why I find great inspiration. I also find great inspiration in looking at these plants in their communities. Because often, as native plant enthusiasts, we default to building a collection of plants, one of this, one of that, one of something else, until we might have 172 different species of plants. And that's fine if that's what you want for yourself. In fact, our backyard, our concept for my backyard at home that I share with Kyra is largely a plant collection, and we have around 125 species and cultivars of native plants. But other parts of our yard are much more based on a plant community concept. And in terms of aesthetics and in terms of a feel, those areas are much more cohesive. And then a big thing to always remember, this area is not a desert. This is something I'm screaming from the hilltops all the time in my work. We have these great archetypical plant communities, our oak woodlands with heavy organic matter accumulation and multiple layers, the very fungal active layer. Chaparral and hot, dry, exposed slopes, but still with very high plant density in all sorts of different forms, different sorts of soil and rock types around. All of its beauty. And so what we're going to start to see here is kind of building in some examples of either landscapes that I have designed or landscapes that I admired and took pictures off the internet from of other designers that kind of start to mimic sort of the feel of some of these communities for specific purposes. So for example, we we're just talking about chaparral, and sometimes in a public landscape, what's going to be suitable is something relatively simple that mimics the most appropriate plant community. So here we have a slope. We actually had somewhat compacted soil on the site because of the construction of this berm. We had south-facing, full blasting sun, reflected heat from the concrete. And so in the design, we went with some low-growing cultivars. This is Montera sagebrush and a ground cover black sage with some Lamus Canyon prince and a little bit of solanum mixed in, but a very simple chaparral mimicking landscape to take these tough conditions. Here is a more diverse landscape. These are both at the Huntington Library and Botanical Gardens. I haven't been back to visit in almost a couple of years now. It feels like I kind of moved a little bit farther away. I've been pretty busy elsewhere, so I'm not sure what these look like today. But the guiding concept in both of these pictures was actually mimicking that kind of diverse shrub layer of chaparral for the soils and the blasting sun that these sites had to deal with. Potentially my favorite in terms of human habitation, oak savanna and meadow. And so this is Santa Rosa Plateau, one of my very favorite places. And here is a landscape designed by Office of Bernard Trainer, which is almost a direct mimic, absolutely gorgeous. This is my yard's version of that, which is our orchard meadow, in which we don't have oak trees, we have fruit trees, and aligning native plants with that frequency of irrigation, we have a meadow understory, which really provides a lot of habitat for beneficial insects, which help us with pests on our fruit trees, and just lots of beauty and additional habitat. So our orchard meadow here with narrowleaf milkweed, yarrow, goldenrod, there's asters, and then a little bit farther away from the fruit trees, you see mule fat as well. Just another close-up of another orchard meadow we have installed. And then riparian communities, which are present and a great way in terms of our design inspiration to make use of areas that are going to be a little bit moister. So here is another example of a pretty simple riparian mimicking installation at the Huntington Library. I believe this area has changed quite a bit since this picture, but that was directly what the inspiration was from. And so as enthusiasts about native plants, we might want more diversity, or we might not. We might get more direct inspiration from certain plant communities in different parts of our gardens, or we might not. But especially when I am dealing with people who are new to native plants and they're excited about it, but having an extremely biodiverse, lots of different plant species and cultivars garden is going to be overwhelming on the maintenance, because most people I interact with who are interested in native plants and are just getting into it don't want to become hobbyist gardeners. They don't want to be out every weekend tending to their garden. They just want something simple, nice, that provides some habitat and is much more interesting than the lawn that they want to tear out. And so oftentimes, in terms of working with that group on design, something that sticks to a well-chosen, simple plant palette that's really evocative of a plant community that is both adapted to the site and that they have an aesthetic response to and feel comfortable in, that's really a successful approach rather than just hitting the nursery and grabbing a bunch of great plants. And so we're going to talk briefly about a couple of different approaches for using plant communities as a basis for design. And I find that depending on the project, I'll follow one of two different approaches. The first one might be deciding on a concept or a feel that I want to achieve and match that to a plant community, or sometimes just getting direct inspiration from the community itself, and then figuring out for the site what are going to be the best plants to meet those goals. So it might not be an exact mimic of a southern oak woodland, but maybe that, because we want an area that feels shady, that's a place of respite when it's hot in the summer, is going to be the feel. And then maybe half, 2/3, 3/4 of the plants would be something that you might find in a southern oak woodland, but not really needing to necessarily be pure or completely dogmatic about it. And then another approach for using plant communities as inspiration would be to fall in love with a bunch of plants and design them into the right spaces, but kind of assemble your own novel plant community by really focusing on researching the needs of the plants, their growth rate, their kind of form, sometimes it's called habit, and focusing on a concept of putting the right plant in the right place, assembling your own plant community for whatever purposes you have. And so just one example of that is a picnic area I designed at the Huntington Library that was installed in February 2015. And the concept for that was to provide an oak woodland that was largely going to be a place where students on field trips would be able to eat lunch. However, the oak trees weren't going to be providing any shade anytime soon. So we couldn't really start with just a straight up oak woodland in an understory planting because we were mostly full sun. So how things settled out was kind of the ecotone between an oak woodland and chaparral. So this is going in 2015. And this is August of the same year. Things really got going and pretty quickly started to provide that feel, obtaining kind of a balance of a natural feel, but also enhancing it a little bit for a more immediate aesthetic impact, including some things that maybe wouldn't in real life grow together, but really providing a kind of naturalistic feel inspired by an oak woodland, and then taking liberties as we wanted to provide the sense that we wanted to for a group that often students might not have ever been in a true native oak woodland, but really wanting to provide that feel and that aesthetic and that sense of arriving after a hot day of trudging around in the gardens in full sun to a space to relax in the shade as the tree canopy grows in. Then another guiding principle for design that I think can be really effective that I basically stole from Mike Evans, who runs Tree of Life Nursery, is encouraging people to create a story or a concept for your garden, even going so far as writing it down. Sometimes you'll know that at the beginning and you can use that to go into the design right at the beginning. Sometimes maybe it crystallizes a little bit later, but then can be used as you do replantings or really final details to pull things together. So for example, our house where we live now in Pomona, our front yard is inspired by a native woodland and will feel kind of like a woodland when things grow in. Our house is a bird blind, how we situated our plantings so that we can see from our windows, even installing a few additional windows in the house in certain areas where they weren't originally, is really to enhance that sense. And it looks out into our backyard, which is partially a native plant collection, partially an orchard meadow, partially a sunken meadow to take our shoes off and stick our feet in the carex on a summer day, and also to be a final infiltration basin that can absorb excess rainwater throughout the whole property, and partially a vegetable garden. So we're lucky to have a large backyard. We can fit a number of stories and concepts all in there together, balancing them using principles of design. And then also remembering that if gardens are habitat for people, they need space for people as well. So gardens need an entrance, paths and other features that define the planted areas. And even though things like patios end up taking space away from plants, in the end, providing for those spaces increases our interaction with our gardens. And sometimes, even in a moderately sized space, will provide separations in different areas, which provide more different microclimates for plant diversity, as well as space for more different vignettes to create a coherent and cohesive design. And so to transition, we're going to talk a bit about some basic elements of design and how they might relate to native plants, being guided by another quote from Mike Evans: "Ugly is not a turf replacement." I'm constantly, when I'm talking to the general public, reminding them of this and reminding them of options of working with plant community inspired native landscapes instead of defaulting to a sea of gravel or wood chip mulch with spotted plants here and there. And so some basic elements of design, and kind of in some senses going in order of operation. First, thinking about landform. Before we start thinking about plants or where to put our plants, are there opportunities to change where soil is, to dig down some areas and fill soil in other areas with specific purposes, perhaps to move or allow rain to soak in, to change our perspective by sinking us down a little bit or raising us up, to alter drainage by sinking the plants down a little bit or raising them up, or anything like that. If you happen to be interested in how to plan out and construct things like dry stream beds, swales, infiltration basins, I am teaching a webinar. It's a little while out, but I believe it's in January. That's all about rainwater harvesting for home gardens. And so if you sign up for my agency's newsletter or follow some links that I'll provide towards the end, I would encourage you to join us for that. And then it'll also be posted online as an archive on YouTube after that. So this is just an example shown before plants had done much growing in and before rock work was finished of our backyard, which had a little bit of a slope from the house towards the backyard. But we decided to use landform to enhance that, both to create a dry stream bed, which brought water even all the way around passively from the front of the house, around the side, and through a series of basins moving down through here. And then ending in this sunken meadow, which we created by digging down and then balancing that soil by throwing it onto the other side, creating a terrace, which extended the patio area into a planting bed, provided the ability for us to use some rocks that we just dug up on site as we're digging the other features to build a couple of dry stacked little terraces, which allowed it to be easier to water the plants on these little sections of slope, and a built-in bench, which when this area is not flooded, which is most of the year, allows us to sit on this bench and enjoy the meadow. Other important basic elements of design: exposure, sun and shade, and microclimates. And some of this might come intuitively to people who have been gardening for a while, but there are some things where I see certain people get tripped up very often. So one example is what to do on the north side of your house or garage, really balancing plants that can take shade most of the year, but full blasting sun in the summer. So this is Lepichinia fragrans, fragrant pitcher sage, one of my favorite plants for that situation because it's very happy in both those conditions, no matter what time of year. And I think one of the more underutilized California native plants in our built landscapes. And then microclimates, particularly hot or cold areas. So in our inland valley areas, hot microclimates like full sun west facing areas, areas along the driveway, areas where the driveway meets the sidewalk, or up against maybe west facing stucco, are all going to be really hot microclimates where no matter what the concept for the plant community might be, I might just stick some desert plants in those areas where they'll not be upset in the summer, but will really respond to that summer heat with more flowering. So another example of a microclimate from our yard is this galvanized water trough, which we turned into a water feature, providing a little bit of space for water plants, a little bit of shade on the north side of that. That also gets just a little bit of splash to keep this as a slightly moister microclimate, knocking down the exposure some. And it really gives us space for, even in a pretty small area, a number of species of plants that we wouldn't have a great space for anywhere else in the yard, including in the center, a stream orchid, which is really not so much part of the design, but just wanted to show off our beautiful stream orchid for a second. Does really happy in that area, which of course we needed to set up our microclimate to get a good place for it. Repetition as well, just another classic design element. So another picture from the Huntington. We had a very biodiverse garden, but along, this is kind of the backside of the main walk, and along both of the edges had this kind of loose drift of, I think it was Pozo blue sage, actually it was Whirly blue sage, black sage. I think there was some sagebrush mixed in, kind of creating this loose drift on either side, so that as there was in some ways so much diversity that there might be a bit of visual chaos in other parts of the garden, that repetition along the back, even though it was informal, was intended to kind of tie things together. And then sometimes just massing is appropriate. And this can often be in a public landscape where the needs should be pretty simple in terms of maintenance, or sometimes could just be the perfect thing for a residential front yard where, again, someone just wants a nice landscape and they're not trying to be a hobbyist gardener, but they want something that's going to be interesting. Something as simple as a large swath of deer grass with a few accents. There's a little bit of some different Cleveland sage cultivars in here, or Cleveland sage hybrid cultivars, might be all that's necessary and could still provide quite a bit of habitat seasonally and be simple to maintain and lovely to look at. And surprise is another classic garden element. And this could be any number of things. It could be walking along a swerving or non-linear path, and all of a sudden your eye turns and you catch a glimpse of something in full bloom just for a few weeks of the year. Or it could be something like this Dudleya and this little bit of rock and broken concrete wall. That's just a detail that at first glance you might not even notice, but provides an additional level of depth once you do. And then in terms of the aesthetic of planting design, texture and color are going to be your classic things to think about. And with color, if you're motivated by it, really thinking about leaf color and texture more than flowers themselves, because pulling off something nice aesthetically with leaf color and leaf texture is going to provide an aesthetic benefit to the landscape 365 days a year, where color comes and goes. So here, just looking at one small example, we have the ferny leaves of yarrow on the ground cover. We have hummingbird sage. We have deer grass. You can see a little bit of the fragrant pitcher sage over here. And so not even mentioning the other plants there, we have all sorts of different textures and then different tones and variations of green. And when the flowers come, it's a bonus, but the landscape itself is handsome and also smells great all year long. Working with grasses is one of my favorite ways to engage with texture as well, because the grasses also really have a long aesthetic season. So grasses to me can really kind of hold a landscape, if used well, throughout the summer once the abundant color of spring is gone, and then combining maybe some buckwheats and California fuchsia into a landscape to have a little bit of flower color that goes farther on. But I think grasses are underutilized overall aesthetically in our built native landscapes. But color can be lovely as well. I encourage people working with native plants to not get too obsessed with color unless they're a particularly color-driven person. Personally, I tend not to worry too much about flower color and what I'm putting next to what, and I just let the colors work themselves out, and they pretty much do. And when there's a lot of contrast and a lot of things going on, it's lovely in one way. And when it ends up being a study in purples, that's lovely in a completely different way. And then the final aspect of kind of different elements of garden design that I want to mention is a concept called cues to care. This is possibly one of the most useful concepts that I learned studying landscape design theory in school. And it's a concept that comes from a woman named Joan Nassauer, who was a landscape psychologist. It's a very specific academic research area. But she was interested essentially in why people think what they do about the landscapes they see. And she became interested in restoration front yard landscapes in a very different part of the country, very different climatic conditions and landscape types. And where she did her focus was on an area where prairie was the natural plant community. And she became interested because she noticed that prairie restoration front yards were starting to go in, and in some neighborhoods and in some locations, people thought they were great, they were beautiful, they were contributing aesthetically, they were helping the environment. And in other situations, landscapes with a lot of the same plants would go in and people thought they were terrible. People thought the front yard had been abandoned. It was full of weeds. It was going to bring down property values, and there would be a car up on blocks in the front yard any day. And she became fascinated with what the differences are. So she did this long study where she created these visual simulations where there's just slight differences in prairie restoration front yard landscapes. And what she came across in some ways seems very intuitive. People like landscapes that they see as cared for and intentional, and they dislike landscapes that they see as not cared for and not intentional. But it didn't necessarily matter if the neighbors understood what was going on exactly with the plants or not. It didn't matter if they could identify the plants or not. There would be simple things called cues to care that could make all the difference. So for example, in this landscape, which is featured many years on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour, I think it's a great example of that. If you were to take out the split rail fence, the rocks, the pavers, some of these details, to the neighbors, this might seem like a very overgrown and rambunctious front yard, but just these extra little cues to care, showing that this is intentional. The rustic fence put in, the groupings of rocks, even the labels on the plants. I don't know if they're year round. And then as we look at other aspects of it, the well-installed, well-maintained, not full of weeds, decomposed granite path, the small rock wall. This is clearly a very cared for, very intentional landscape, which follows, not necessarily intentionally, this cues to care theory, where it wouldn't matter if the neighbors understood what's going on with the plants, and it wouldn't matter necessarily if they prefer a more formal look themselves, but that clearly this is an intentional and cared for landscape. And I don't know the exact context in this neighborhood, but I would guess that this front yard is accepted just fine in this landscape. And it's a lovely place to be. And I believe that this newspaper out here is not a prop, and that in fact the owners like to sit out here and enjoy the landscape and see the neighbors, and the neighbors are probably interested more than upset. And so with that, I'm looking at the question and answer, and there's not much coming in yet, just one question, which I would be happy to answer towards the end. I also want to look at, other than parts of theory, other garden elements to pair with our native landscapes and our native plantings. And so here I'm going to pull in pictures from a lot of different gardens, mostly based on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. Some of these are pictures that I have taken on the tour, and some of these are ones that Theodore Payne Foundation has put out in promotion of their tours, used with permission. So looking at how to integrate things like patios and different material types that match well with our native or partially native landscapes. And so sometimes the least expensive materials like gravel or decomposed granite really, really work aesthetically with our native landscapes, but really thinking through those aspects of the landscapes, the pathways, the materials of the pathways all contribute in some cases as much as the plants to the feel of the landscape, the function of the landscape in terms of how the people who use it are able to get around, and even the maintenance of the landscape and our ability to effectively and comfortably do seasonal maintenance. Broken concrete is often available if a garden renovation is happening and can be a very useful material. Or even really setting a tone of using square pavers for a very modern feel that provides a balance to the wildness in other sections of the landscape. Flagstone is an example here, decomposed granite. And some of these things can literally just come from the hardware store. Or for woodland situation, really working with wood chip mulch and branches. And then rainwater capture, kind of tying back to the landform discussion. Integrating things like dry stream beds, which can function both as drainage, as mechanisms for holding water in the landscape to both, in a small rain event, help our landscapes pull more water so we can water them a little bit less, and in a large rain event, actually helping recharge the groundwater table, to also providing for spaces of focus and aesthetic enhancements of our garden to make our garden feel like more than a collection of plants. And again, if your motivation for your garden is specifically to have a collection of plants and you're not interested in the other aspects, then that's fine. But if you are, really thinking through how all of this comes together can really not only provide more general visual interest, but also enhance the look of a plant collection. And in some cases, if it alters the microclimate, can even enhance the health, the longevity of the plant collection as well. And so with that, I want to pull together those concepts, cover a few others, and do one example of going through a quick process of design, which would start with evaluating your site, assuming that you don't have a long-lived native plant collection already, but you're going to be doing a major renovation, or you're advising someone who might be getting into this for the first time on how to take on a major renovation. A lot of people like to get excited and start accumulating plants. But way before that, I encourage people to evaluate the site and first think about the plants and features they want to keep. A garden doesn't need to be all or nothing with California natives, but making sure to match maybe existing higher water demanding plants. If there's a, for example, beautiful mature magnolia tree, wanting to work with native plants doesn't mean you need to cut down the magnolia. You might want to, but you can also keep an area that you know is going to get more water than some of your maybe typical go-to native plants, and match that with plants from riparian plant communities or things that will thrive with the same amount of water as the existing plants. Can't tell you how many times I've seen people get excited about low water or native plants and a year later wonder why their birch tree isn't doing well. And so as part of that process, I always like to start with a sketch of the area. Doesn't need to be a work of art, doesn't need to be perfectly to scale on graph paper. Normally what I would do is just pull up on Google Maps or Google Earth an aerial photo, enhance it or enlarge it to roughly showing the site, and then do a couple of quick sketches. Normally I'll throw out the piece of paper about 2 or 3 times, and by the 3rd or 4th one, I have something that's good enough. In this case, I did it digitally just to be able to have it show well on a slideshow. And so this is an example of going through the design of the medium-sized front yard at the place that Kyra and I live now. It's about 1,200 square feet. It's on a cul-de-sac, and so you can see the street is curved. Our driveway is here. Here's the main planting area. The neighbor has a gravel strip, and then their driveway. And something I really like to take into account when I'm doing this is making sure that I place the window locations. If there's a screen door and the door is going to be open in the summer, the door locations. Because for most of us, especially for front yards, where oftentimes we see it when we're coming and going, but don't spend a lot of time in the front yard itself, we might spend more time actually relating to this yard, viewing it through windows than we do actually out in the yard. And so how things are framed might come more from this perspective rather than from the street or from actually being in the yard. And with that basic layout, I'll also match and list goals for the project. Everything always starts with goals. And so again, if the goal is to have a huge plant collection, that's great. For this project, the goals were to have it be beautiful, to have it provide lots of habitat, to have it be low water. To enhance the sense of privacy was very important because being on a cul-de-sac that has mostly small front yards or all small front yards, from any place inside the house, usually there's 4 to 5 different houses that are all kind of pointed at any window. We wanted to also have it smell great all the time, coming to and from the car with the windows open on a summer day. And because our area doesn't have a lot of street trees, it's hot in the summer, but we get a great view facing north at the San Gabriel Mountains. And so we wanted to have those goals really figured out so we can come up with a design that enhances our sense of privacy, but also preserves our view of the mountains. And so by listing the goals, we knew that one of the things we're going to need to be very careful with is the heights of different plants to really provide that basic balance. And so with that, we jump into site analysis, which starts with observing things for as long as it takes. And sometimes that's a full year. Sometimes, if you've been there for a long time, this site analysis process might be just writing down the observations that you already intuitively know, maybe going out into your yard to refresh your memory as you create this analysis chart. Marking down things like sun and shade, how that changes throughout the year, especially on the north-facing yard. Soil and drainage. I'm not going to take the time to get into a soil and drainage test, but I will say you can look up how to do it online. But a key thing that oftentimes online instructions miss is that when you dig holes to do a soil and drainage test, you need to fill them up at least once, ideally twice, and let that water drain out before you fill it up and start timing it. Because if the soil isn't already evenly wet all around and underneath that hole, you're not going to be testing drainage. You're really going to be testing the dynamics of wetting dry soil, which will give you a totally different result. If you have 2 to 3 inches of hour per drainage, congratulations, you have well-drained soil, and you can most likely plant the whole variety of plants that need well-drained soil. If your drainage is less than 1 inch per hour, whether it's from clay soil or compaction, still have plenty of options to work with, but focus on plants from lists of plants that can tolerate clay soil, and I'll share one with you in just a moment. Views is really important, both views that you want to maintain, as well as views that you might want to block. Like if your neighbor built a second-story addition that now looks directly down into your hot tub, your design is a time where you can figure out what plants you want to put in to block that without having to build a 20-foot wall made out of concrete. Microclimates, hot or cold areas, we already talked about those. Noise and other neighbor issues, if you might need the sound of a water feature to calm down noise from a noisy neighborhood. And existing plants you want to keep, including seasonal weeds that you know that you might need to battle. And so maybe you would hold off on 1 or 2 areas of your planting until that's more under control. And you want to make sure that you're going to take into account and get input from all the important stakeholders in your planning. So this is me with 2 of my most important stakeholders looking out into our very young backyard, thinking about next steps as the garden evolves. And so here is putting that all together in just a basic site analysis plan. So doesn't need to be rocket science. It's really just a fancy way of writing down what you see. So our mountain view is important. This area of the planting felt too open. Here is our north side where we knew that we're gonna have to be dealing with seasonal shade, but then come this time of year, full blasting sun. And so that was gonna definitely have an impact on our plant selection. And then what we found out after our first winter there was that we had flooding issues in this part of the yard. There is just a little bit of slope headed this way, but the house doesn't have rain gutters. The way that the eaves are shaped would make it very hard to put in without a ton of work. And so all of the water from the roof would come here. We get a little bit of water coming down from our dead lawn, and it would all accumulate right here. And on a big rain event, we'd have an inch of water sitting up against our foundation that we'd have to trudge through as we went to and from. So by putting all of this down, we can start to think about how we're going to turn these problems into solutions with the design as we put in our great plant community, as we build a little bit of our plant collection in the front yard. By using this very intentional design process, we can also make sure we're taking into account all of these other issues. And so with that, we start thinking about plants, just the very basics of it, focusing again on right plant, right place, and matching plants to soil and site conditions. You will never successfully change your soil type. If you have clay soil, you don't ever want to add sand. It's just going to be a recipe for concrete. What you want to do is match what you have. If you have highly compact soil, over years, plant growth, wood chip mulch decomposing might loosen it some. But for the most part, if you're going to be planting anytime soon, you want to match what you have. Sun and shade, plant size. Oftentimes, young or new gardeners will put way too many plants because they don't think plants are going to grow in anytime soon. With some of our native plants, they'll get that 6 to 8 feet wide in a year and a half. And if we put in too many things, they'll be overgrown and much harder to maintain. So right plant, right place, sun, shade, size, soil type, and drainage are going to be our top factors. And that could lead to fun research. So most of you probably know about CalScape already. If you don't, check out CalScape. That's going to be your #1 resource for learning about native plants. But I also want to show you one resource which you might not have heard of, and that's the Inland Valley Garden Planner. This is a resource that was created by my agency, which was really created by Bob Perry, a well-known Southern California landscape architect, and his team, and kind of in collaboration with me in some of the later phases. This is a website all about choosing and learning about the best plants for Southern California, specifically inland gardens. It's not 100% native, but it has detailed profiles and information on about, I think it's 112 native plants. So far less than CalScape, but especially if you're working with or doing outreach with beginning gardeners, I've had a lot of people tell me that CalScape is a little bit intimidating with all that information. So in terms of native plant resources, I kind of consider that the Bible, but this is really useful for a lot of people as well. And so there's a lot of different features here. If you're interested at all, I'd encourage you to explore it and check it out, inlandvalleygardenplanner.org. But the heart of it is Plant Finder, which is a searchable database. And so if you're interested, you can try, for example, California native shrubs that take full sun, that take, for example, clay soil, if you know you have that poor drainage, and that are good butterfly plants as well. And so that gets us from the 112, what I would say, how we selected them are kind of top native plants that people are likely to pretty consistently find in local nurseries. They might need to go to specialty places like Theodore Payne Foundation or Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden or California Botanic Garden, Tree of Life Nursery. But they're the kind of things that pretty reliably throughout much of the season will be available there, and they're pretty easy to be successful with in the garden. So for all of those, then we get down to 11 that then people can look at by size, visual presence, all of that. And then each one of these, there's pictures, close up, far away, it uses Bob Perry's database of probably tens of thousands of photos that he's accumulated over his lifetime. I need to move some zoom windows around so I can minimize this. And then a description, very simple water needs, recommendations for inland Southern California schedules. So we've done a lot of that local work for people. If people need to know how to take these recommendations in terms of inches of water every so often and understand how do they program their actual irrigation system to do that, we have some links and even some custom programmed online calculators for them. Then the basic elements, and then something that I and one of my coworkers put a lot of our free time into over a year or so is we have maintenance entries for every single one of the plants in this database, including what to do and what time of the year to do it. And all of those sources are cited. So if you're interested, you can see some of them are just from our experience and some of them are using other native plant databases or authoritative sources. So that's the Inland Valley Garden Planner. We also are in the middle of working on what I think is a very exciting project about design for these kinds of gardens, and it's going to have a lot of information about design and design templates with California native plants. And so, for example, for people who are interested in creating a woodland garden or a pollinator-focused garden on a small-sized front yard or a medium-sized backyard, we're going to have lots of inspiration and specific design recommendations about those. That's a project that we are in the middle of working on, and we'll probably have it up online sometime this fall. So please check back. And so to get back to the presentation. And Cliff, if I am going too long, please tell me to wrap it up at any point in time. I'm seeing that we still have 50 participants in the meeting, so I'm assuming that people are still engaged, but I do know that it is starting to get a little bit later. So, so feel free to give me a nudge whenever you might think it's necessary.
Well, yeah, I'm always of the mind that if we're getting good information, I'd like to just keep on going. And if anybody wants to leave or needs to leave, they can do that. And without disturbing anybody else.
Okay, and I promise we're not going to be going all night, but yeah, just wanted to throw that out there just in case.
I would say not past midnight. Okay.
Okay. So
maybe by 9 o'clock. That's 20 minutes.
Yeah, we'll be done by then for sure.
Good.
Thank you. So here are some other favorite places online that I like to do my research. And here's a key thing for us plant nerds. Whenever you're working on a design, it always feels like infinite potential, and we think about the possibilities and we fall in love with a bunch of plants. And one thing, especially if we're engaging with the average person who's maybe hasn't fully gone down the rabbit hole of native plants, is remembering that sometimes it's better to keep it simple and don't put in too many plants and crowd them. That's really where a lot of first-time gardeners and plant enthusiasts go wrong, is they'll put in 72 different plants in a front yard when really 12 to 15 well-chosen plants is probably the maximum for most people to be successful, both with the maintenance as well as with finding some sort of aesthetic balance. And then it's a lot easier from there to add in a few different species over additional years rather than to start too complicated and reel it back in. And then another thing that I really like to work with native plants, and I actually find is one of the most rewarding parts in terms of aesthetic design, is tuning into our seasons and understanding that as part of the design. So if certain plants go a little bit yellow or gold in the summer, or have dried seed heads like the buckwheats that hold, really fully embracing our landscapes as things that should change throughout the year and shouldn't look like the peak of springtime all year long. So jumping back into the design, what does that all say about how this comes together? Well, so we go from that basic analysis to starting to very roughly hatch in what needs to happen in different places. So not fully placing plants already. Sometimes this is called a bubble diagram. But in this example, we knew that we were going to want some sort of informal hedge here because, for example, I'm sitting right here at a desk out this window. And the way things actually line up is a significant amount of the view is actually the neighbor's driveway. And another significant amount of the view is the wide stretch of asphalt in the cul-de-sac. And so by putting an informal hedge here, we can provide a new backdrop for the landscape, which is going to be much more attractive while still allowing the main view of the mountains to go above it. On this side, we wanted a small deciduous tree, something that would be multi-trunk, that would be more closed in different parts of the year, but then be able to be a little bit more open, but still the multiple trunks of that deciduous tree providing a little bit of sense of shelter. And specifically by putting that here, we could align the view from the main windows that we would see this landscape out of with one of the trees in the background that already blocks the mountains in one area, but still leaving a lot of the mountain view open. We wanted something small and evergreen here to provide a more dense block of this view, as well as to block off part of our other view, which is of our own cars parked in the driveway. And then we were going to work with layers, starting with a low meadow, moving to some medium accent shrubs, and then this larger layer in the back. Working with multiple layers from a specific viewpoint is one of the easiest ways to build a sense of depth that can, in fact, make a smaller space feel larger. We have so many great small to medium-sized shrubs with native plants that it's easy aesthetically to end up with kind of an overly shrubby landscape where it's a bunch of shrubs and then maybe some ground covers, perennials, and wildflowers at the edges. So by being intentional with our sense of depth, we can really control the feel of our spaces. And then we make some notes about the sunshade situations because the next step we'll start thinking about what plants go where. You can see these little C's here, which were notes to keep in mind small pops of color, especially in areas like this, because as we built the sense of privacy, we also didn't want to fully turn our back on the neighborhood. So for example, we'll have this informal hedge here, but providing a small pop of color in this corner gives the neighbor also a little something to look at as they're coming and going into their driveway. Same thing over in this corner and here as well. Thinking about the neighbors, thinking about the experience even of the mailman as he comes to our house every day and not wanting the landscape to totally turn its back to the neighborhood. And then finally, looking at the water situation by installing a French drain, which is essentially a trench that's then filled with a coarse gravel that allows water to move through. Exactly where the water accumulates, going under the walk around the side of the house, and then connecting all of that to a series of dry stream beds and an infiltration basin in the back, we're able to completely solve the water issue and turn that problem into a resource. So moving from there, start to just kind of fill in and refine. So here for the main plants, we ended up choosing a couple of shrubs that are going to be limbed up into trees, figured out our main species and roughly how wide we want the groupings of plants to be for our hedge, and then starting to figure out. So you can see we ended up with a little bit wider of an area for the medium-sized shrubs, but we realized that some of them are going to be, in fact, a large bunch grass. We're going to use deer grass, and so refining that a little bit, our main species for our meadow areas. And from there, slowly but surely, we can get to getting it all down to scale, getting our exact plant counts together. Now, if you are the kind of person who likes to work more intuitively and is never going to draw everything out to scale on graph paper, that's fine. You can do that. That's more of Kyra, my partner's style, and she has a great eye for gardening and a natural eye for balance. She is the kind of person who can also look at a room and just kind of instantly know how the furniture should be laid out. I'm the kind of person who will look at the room and think we can fit 5 more pieces of furniture into that room than we actually can. So for me, I need to go to scale everything drawn out to get my plant counts. If you are not going to be doing that on a computer program, a great and free resource put out by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is this publication called Lawn Be Gone. And in it, they cover a lot of useful information. I set up a quick link so you can download that book if you go to cbwcd.org/G3book. And in that, starting on page 8, they really go through drawing out a site plan, thinking through how to set up your drainage to hold that rain, and then moving into drawing your plants out to scale to get exactly where they are in the plant counts. I tend to work more on computers because I do this day in, day out, but it's the same idea. But even then, you can see it. This is something that I did before I drew all of this out for an example. This is something that I did before we did our full site analysis after we have lived here for a few months. And you can see I made changes where the plants are going to be, some of the sizes of the plants, where the water drainage features are going to be, changed a little bit. The field didn't change. And so I had this enough that I never actually went back, because it's just our own project, to redo this scale drawing. I changed my plant counts for the hedges and kind of manipulated things on site from there, still really achieving the same effect. So realizing that design as it is on paper is really just a tool to help you get to your end result. And so to kind of pull that together with an example, here's the house when we moved in. Here's it with the lawn partially dead in January of 2019. Here's March planting day. We would have loved to plant in the fall, but we just had too much going on because we moved in the fall. So kind of planting as late as we were comfortable in the season, but we weren't going to wait a whole other year to get it in. And then going back as we laid out plants and really making sure that it would feel like a comfortable place to be in with our body as we had the plants laid out, kind of picturing things in our mind's eye as they grew in, getting going on planting. And so this is March 14th, front yard is planted, and it always looks something like this at the beginning, where you think this is never going to grow in, there's nothing to see. But have faith in your research and your plant sizes, because it is coming. It's our delivery of mulch for the front yard and the backyard. We knew that Bermuda grass would be coming back, so doing some mulching with recycled cardboard that will break down and just kind of biodegrade after about a year. About 2 months, plants starting to grow. You can see we still had some more larger cobble to bring back in to make this drainage feature, the French drain, look a little bit more natural, but starting to come together a little bit. And then in August that year, I was walking by the front door one day when it was hot. We had the screen open, and all of a sudden I realized we could actually see much more green than we could mulch. It's a garden at about 5 months. So starting to grow in, and you can see here, we had that woodland concept eventually, but we weren't dogmatic about it because, for example, this spot's super hot. And we knew that putting in a desert species, this firecracker penstemon, Penstemon etonii, would be one of those great pops of color because it would suck in all of this reflected heat from the driveway and concrete and just bloom and bloom and bloom in response to it, where we stuck to really more woodland species in the more sheltered areas. And over time, as things grow in, the sun and shade will change, and it might scoot more to being a true woodland over time. Leafcutter bees showing up and digging in on the western redbud. It truly is in most of our suburbs with the habitat. If you build it, they will come quite quickly. And so this is August, and we had the hummingbirds move in. So this hummingbird would hang out on this little dried California fescue stalk every morning. I would sit on the couch and eat breakfast and kind of say hi and see this hummingbird for a number of weeks every single morning. And so it still has a lot of growing in to do, but this is the landscape on trash day. And there's always a few issues, a little too much heat for the red buckwheat that we were trying to use as one of those pops of color for the neighborhood. This is west facing on the east side. They're doing quite a bit better. And so this is the landscape at approximately 6 months, already doing quite a bit more than the lawn it replaced, starting to provide a little bit of sense of privacy, still has a lot of growing in to do, providing plenty of beauty, plenty of habitat already. This is this season, about 13 months. We had another pile of mulch delivered for the backyard, so I was able to climb up on top of it and get a little bit of a different view. Our toyon starting to grow in. And a lot of these juxtapositions of color, of texture, starting to show up. The hedges starting to grow in with these coffee berries. Feels a little bit more enclosed in terms of actually blocking the view. Probably needs another year or two, but you can see this very successful pop of color. We talked about leaving that corner so that the neighbors have something to look at and they get a little bit of layering as well. More generous with the internal layering than the external layering, but still thinking through. A little bit of contrast, some color, some seasonality. So after these have finished, we'll probably still have some California fuchsia, start early in the spring with the verbena over here, and then early spring with the flowering of the redbud, which is a knockout from every side, and the whole neighborhood can enjoy it. Really working with textures, so this glowing fuzz of the fragrant pitcher sage. And this landscape not only smells great, but in a morning when you catch the early morning eastern sun, it literally glows, and it's hard to capture that between the yarrow and the other fuzzy plants. And so you can see our meadow area. So in the areas that have a little bit more of that northern shelter, working with heucheras, some penstemons, and then yarrow. And then this is from just yesterday. So kind of as that seasonal change happens in some of our more full blasting sun areas, it doesn't look spring fresh anymore, and that's just fine. But internally, now the yarrow comes in and the coyote mint comes in. So we get this whole other juxtaposition as this kind of cascade through the seasons, all kind of developed through that sense of design very intentionally. And then even when those are done, you can still see those textural differences with the dark green in the background and the deer grass repeated in different areas to kind of pull together that meadow feel, and then different pops of color. And so we're briefly going to wrap up talking about some other things. A note on mulches. Don't just default to wall-to-wall wood chip mulch, but think about the plant community that you're emulating and go from there. Oftentimes what I'll do is I'll start with wall-to-wall mulch because the price is right. We can get it for free, and it's a good way to just cool off the soil, keep it from being beat down by the sun, help with the weeds at the beginning. And then over time, we'll work with other bits of organic matter, rocks, and gravel as we get a hold of them, and kind of build something that's more naturalistic and more complex. And then also thinking about, in addition to our enthusiasm for native plants, the habitat implications. And so by matching our plants, which provide the food and shelter, with well-placed water features, with other additional things, thinking about like plant density, maybe having some corners of the yard where there's really good cover, we can enhance our ability to provide habitat as well. If you're interested in learning more about that, I'm actually this Saturday morning teaching a 3-hour workshop on gardening for birds, pollinators, and butterflies. And you can check that out at cbwcd.org/waterwise workshops. You can sign up for the free workshop from 9 to noon this Saturday, and we'll also be recording that and posting that to YouTube later, mostly focused in the living component of that on native plants as well. If you want to, you can choose target species to support. But really, if you plant a variety of native plants of different sizes that bloom throughout the year, provide a source of water, and crucially, when your plant's flowers fade, don't cut off the seed heads too soon. And when you do, leave them in the garden, you will add an entire other level to your native garden in terms of providing habitat. So this was a picture I took today of the goldfinches coming in. Our white sage is not really even have ripe seed yet, but the goldfinches decided they were good enough, and they whole swarm of them spend a good 20 minutes picking off the white sage right at the edge of our patio. Water features, we get a number of different hawks that visit our garden on a regular basis. And this is the view from the bed in our bedroom. It's a cell phone picture that Kyra took, but again, just a little bit of water and you will provide so much additional value to the wildlife. Can be very inexpensive. This is one of my favorite approaches, just a glazed ceramic saucer on a tree stump. Remember to leave a patch or two of bare soil for the native ground-dwelling bees, a few piles of rocks for the lizards, and a few logs or larger branches for all sorts of things, including all sorts of little insects that will use those for food or habitat, and then in turn be food for the birds. And then to wrap things up, these are also our gardens. So remembering to provide human habitat, whether it's a place to sit and read or sit and eat, or sit and enjoy the morning. Our gardens are going to seem easier to care for if they're comfortable spaces they enjoy spending time in. And it doesn't need to be expensive. So I drove by sometime last year, a native front yard in Pomona, where I live, and I pulled over. I thought this was great. I realized that it's on a pretty busy street. These people probably took out a lawn. And this landscape, if it was all planted from 1 gallon plants, could have probably cost around $80 to $90 worth of 1 gallon plants and a packet of wildflower seeds. But as a landscape that does so much, provides privacy, smells great, provides habitat, looks much more interesting than the lawn. So some final thoughts to wrap up. When you're thinking about design, you can really achieve a lot for your landscape, balancing multiple different desires for how that landscape is going to change your experience of enjoying your yard while providing you a great plant collection by thinking about your goals, focusing on them, using them as your filter, and sometimes using them from preventing you from putting in just too many different types of plants, one each. But keeping it as a garden by keeping it a little bit simple, really focusing on right plant, right place, and thinking about how much time you want to spend working in your garden. And if you want 172 different plants, that's great, but you don't necessarily need that. Understand and make sure to periodically test your irrigation. Talk to a lot of people that have issues with their plants because they get more excited about plants than irrigation. That's understandable. If you're one of those people, Waterwise Community Center is teaching all sorts of irrigation classes all throughout the summer. Do a bit of research using your resources. And when you think about maintenance, really think more about care. If we care for our gardens will care for us. It can be very helpful to chart your plants and make a calendar of care for you or your gardener. Look to nature and try to have nature's patience. There's few mistakes. Learn from your experiences. The garden is never done, but also don't forget to enjoy it. And so with that, thank you very much for your interest. I listed a couple of Waterwise Community Center's websites and resources. And if we have a little bit of time, we will answer some questions now.
I see there are some questions in the Q&A. Maybe we could take a few minutes to go through some of those if we can be quick about it.
Absolutely. So from Anonymous, if you were to select a handful of native plants to start landscaping with, what would you consider as 5 staple plants? What I will do is I will refer you to the Inland Valley Garden Planner. If you go there, there's a section that says helpful lists. And the first list there is favorite plants for inland gardens. And I would refer you to that. Beautiful, great plants that are easy to care for. Next question from Drew. Where do people find natural looking rock and decomposing wood? Wood, you find it where you get it. All the stuff in the pictures from our garden were junk, kind of weedy seedling trees, a lot of them ash trees that were about to fall over when we moved in and we had to get them removed. But tree trimmers, taking down trees that don't have diseases in your neighborhood is going to be the easiest. Rock, you can go to landscape supply yards. It's going to depend what area you're in. San Gabriel Valley, La Cañada rustic stone is a major source. If you're out more towards where I am, Inland Empire, there's a yard called Wolfenbarger and a yard called Ontario Building Materials, which are great sources of different sizes of stone that you can get. Barbara, hey Barbara. An early slide when you're talking about your home orchard meadow. Are you watering the meadow in the dry season? How often? Yeah, so basically what we do is we have those areas of fruit trees on a overhead spray system that I could provide you with more details with later. You know how to get in touch with me, Barbara, if you need to. But basically it's on an overhead spray system where we mounted those sprinklers 2 feet above the ground, and everything gets watered right now just for the fruit tree irrigation schedule, deep soak once a week. When they're older, it'll be every other week. And we just matched everything in that meadow plant community to things that we thought would work with that. And that's all of that sort of stuff. And going on to Laura. At Theodore Payne, I was told natives would usually need some watering the first 2 years, but I'm finding that a few still need watering after 2 years. I'm finding a dripping hose is best for these, so plants that need less water are not affected. More info about watering in general. Okay. Normally what I will default to, and this is situationally dependent, is that in most of my gardens, unless there's a reason to do otherwise, I will give native landscapes on average a good deep soak once a week, about 1 inch of water a week the first year, and then depending on their growth, rapidly taper off after that, usually ending at watering, doing 1 irrigation event per month, supplying, in the months that it doesn't rain, supplying about 1 inch of water. But for best plant health, what I will do, and this is something I learned from Mike Evans at Tree of Life Nursery, and he has some good videos online about watering for native plants, is I will split that 1 inch of water, equivalent of a 1 inch rain event, a good deep soak, that I want to provide, up to watering early morning, 3 mornings in a row, sequentially getting a deeper penetration into the soil, but without spending hours and hours and hours of having the foliage wet from a sprinkler system. That seems to be what I've seen to be the best balance between providing an occasional deep soak to keep things looking good and avoiding disease issues. And then if you are interested in learning more about that, Laura, in the fall, I teach an installation and establishment of native landscapes class that will also be online this fall. And we'll get into that kind of establishment watering and transitioning out of it much more. We also have some other kind of showing different irrigation types, workshops over the summer that I would invite you to join. Stephen, have any of your neighbors changed their landscapes in their front yard since you planted your front yard? No, none of them have yet. Hasn't been around for that long, but I don't necessarily expect them to. But none of them have complained either. So I'll count that as a win because we have a pretty wild front yard. Chokis asks, what type of water feature do you use on a hillside? Any sources for architectural gardens? I'm not quite sure what you mean about architectural gardens. You might mean more formal gardens, in which case, for really high-end gardens, and then maybe you can get inspiration from that, you might look at Ground Studio. They have beautiful pictures online. And then I also talk a little bit more about formal gardens, not a ton, in a class that I have called DIY Landscape Design that is up at the YouTube site that's on the screen right now. On a hillside, it's kind of tough. I might work with something that can be relatively small and contained, like something built out of a large ceramic pot where you can just kind of even out a small area or a small platform and work with a very small fountain pump in a ceramic pot with the bottom sealed up. Can provide a lot of habitat even just with that.
Okay, Scott, I see we have one more question there. If we can make that quick, then we can wrap up.
Sounds good. I see the water main in your diagram. Any plants in particular to avoid planting near there? If you have an old leaky water main, any plants or trees will follow that water and find it. If you have a good shaped new water main, you don't need to worry about it. I happen to have a water main that was reinstalled at 6 inches deep, so I needed to worry about that if I was doing any significant digging, and also putting in the French drain system is why that was important there. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk. And if you have any other questions, you're welcome to get in touch with me. You can find my email address at that cbwcd.org website. Okay,
thank you, Scott. You can see we still have most of our participants still online here, which shows that they found it to be a useful and interesting topic and presentation. I thought it was very well done. Thank you. So for everybody, looks like our next scheduled event will probably be our September meeting, but if we have an opportunity to do anything earlier than that, we'll send out notice to our email list. Thank you very much for coming.